Hello, my name's Lesley Atherton, and this is one of my earliest pieces of writing based on lots and lots of children's animated TV series and just kind of stream of consciousness pushed into some form of story. It's just really strange. It's called Chip the Armoured Dragon. Chip, the slightly clueless armoured dragon, was not at his best. He was tired, he was hungry, and when he looked in his mirror, he realised he looked even dopier than usual. This town wasn't a fun place to live when you were a weary armoured dragon. Chip's ancestors, the old-school armoured dragons, were generally known for their toughness and their amazing fire-breathing, but Chip knew himself that he was a gormless and weak reptile. There was no way in the world that he could ever do their kind of work. Worst of all his problems was that his fiery breath didn't work at all. He was becoming desperate. Without a home, without regular employment, and without love, he had done something he'd always vowed never to do. He had allowed his desire for mouth fire to get the better of him, and tried an old witch's suggestion of drinking magic potions to ignite his missing flames. He had taken more and more of the potion, and tried to flame all over the town. But when he failed, every time, he knew that his dragon services would never be required again. That was when Chip began sleeping in a rubbish dump and eating all the town's unwanted scraps. It was a terrible way for an armoured dragon to live, no matter how much help he was given. And no matter how much help he was given, he would not perk up. There was one person who remained friendly with Chip, even in his reduced circumstances, Darryl from Moorland Hall. Quite often it was said that Darryl's greatest pleasure was the misery and misfortune of others, but Chip, in his naive ignorance, had always believed Darryl was his only true friend and supporter. Chip decided to visit Darryl at Moorland Hall for advice. They'd become a lot closer since Darryl realised he was all Chip had. He hated to watch the unhappiness writhing on Chip's trusting face. "Howdy," Chip said, slurring and looking more than a little confused. He'd already forgotten why he'd visited Darryl. All he knew was that he was wearing his rainbow hat at a jaunty angle. His long green tail was strong and tough, and his huge nose was cool and wet. He may have been confused, but at least he looked smart. He admired himself for a moment in Darryl's hall mirror. "What you up to?" Darryl asked. Chip remembered. "I need your help, please. I can't flame, and it's breaking me." Chip couldn't finish his sentence, so addled was his brain on toadstool juice, his preferred local hallucinogenic delicacy. "Chip, you're not talking sense. You must be tired. You need a holiday." Chip nodded dumbly. Darryl looked as if he was considering the matter. "You could always go to stay with my friend," Darryl suggested. "Oh," said Chip. "Yes," said Darryl, smiling in encouragement. "He's a great boy. Magic dragon he is, by the name of Tinder. You'll love him. Mind, he lives a fair old bit away, but it is by the seaside, in a caravan park. It'd do you good to get there for a visit. I bet he has some brilliant fire-raising techniques." Chip stood around for a minute, scratched, sniffed, and took a swig from his bottle wrapped in a brown paper bag. Clifford's DIY store. He would miss that enormous cavernous repository of toadstool juice if he went on holiday. He stood a bit longer and watched the tomato plants on Darryl's window ledge quiver massively, almost in expectation. "All right," he said finally, draining the last drop from his bottle and slamming it down on Darryl's table with a massive crash. "Tinder? Yes, I bet he's easily inflamed. I really think that I will visit him." For a moment, Darryl considered warning Chip of the journey's perils and what he might find at the end. But what the hell, it would be far more useful to Chip if he was to find it out for himself. So, handing him a map to the magical caravan park, Darryl said goodbye and left Chip to trudge back to the rubbish dump and prepare for his inspirational adventure. He had high hopes. Perhaps this would help to put right all the things he'd done wrong. He packed his massive frame rucksack with a light heart and a crate of toadstool juice. It was going to be a long journey. There was nobody to see him off, to wave at him or to say goodbye. He had few friends left. The toadstool juice had seen to that. So once he was packed, he set off, his rucksack on his back. He didn't want to carry such a big sack such a long way, but he knew he must. After all, he may be gone for good. After Chip had taken about 200 clumping dragony footsteps out of the village, he became hungry, so settled down for a toadstool juice. And as he sat on the rock to rest his tired tail, he realised that he could hear a boinging noise. There it was again, with the boing, boing, boing getting nearer. And suddenly someone began shouting, "You're not Zebedee, you know. Bring back my pogo stick." The voice tailed off into the distance, and the boinging got quieter till there was no more. Chip reckoned that it sure was weird once you left home, but all was forgotten after his meal of egg and cress sandwiches and a good slug of the hard stuff. Chip was soon on his way again. Plod, 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 out of the safety of his cruel and lonely town. Plod, 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 into a place he'd never even dreamed of. A city, a cartoon city, complete with cartoon cats, a cartoon policeman and cartoon cars. It was too much for the gentle Armoured Dragon. After all, he could see in 3 dimensions, so cartoon characters were extremely confusing. What, he wondered, was round the back of them? Whatever it was, Chip suspected they were up to no good, because this was the first policeman he'd ever seen, and he knew they didn't send policemen to the nice parts of town. Chip knew he must escape, lumberingly, before he got involved in anything he might regret. So, plod, 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 he trudged through the city streets paved with gold, and at a crossroads, while taking a break to siphon a tad more toadstool juice into his toothless dragon mouth, he took his first proper look at the map to Tinder's place. It was full of scribbled notes and advice he could barely read. Oh no, this was really, really confusing. Normally he just muddled through and things always turned out okay in the end, but this time it wasn't going to be as easy as that. He had to take control for once in his life. He stared stupidly at the map for a good 20 minutes before it began to make sense. It seemed that he had 3 options. Number 1, to leave the safety of built-up places and to clamber through a cave system to a little place called Victim Blood. On the map was written, "Beware of the killing dragons." Chip knew just how overly playful the killing dragons could be. He decided against that route. Number 2, to travel via a teleporting address. It was a possibility, but he'd have to be transported to another colourful world temporarily, while learning something dreadfully important about his inner self and the universe in the process. He wasn't sure. It sounded like something that might not suit a very dozy Armoured Dragon. Option 3 gave him the option to tramp through even more urban streets to an inner-city school. Oh, thought Chip, I've got to choose, and I just don't know. He sat and thought a bit longer. Poor Chip wasn't the brightest of creatures, and hadn't worked out that this map was a bit different. It wasn't an A to Z of dragon locations. It was a one-of-a-kind map. It had to be this because he was going to visit Tinder, a very magical dragon on a very magical caravan site. That meant that his whole journey there would have to be, by its very nature, magical, hence the map. It was the most magical map ever. It led the reader only in the directions it fancied sending them in, as a kind of temperamental magic. So instead of giving Chip a clear and straight route to his destination, it gave him a route through hills and valleys, cities, gardens and caves. After 10 more minutes of thinking, Chip really wasn't sure what was going on, and even if he wanted to continue. The strap kept coming off his rucksack, and he was running out of egg and cress sandwiches. Then, all of a sudden it came to him. He would ask somebody for help. He vowed to ask the first creature, person or talking thing he met. So he turned his big bulky body round to look this way and that, in the hope that he was no longer alone. Nothing was there at first, but from the road to the caves he suddenly could see something moving, hurtling towards him at an enormous speed, a big red van. "Stop, stop," bumbled Chip, waving his tail and his hat and anything else that would move. "Stop!" The van screeched to a halt right in front of him. Phew, that was close. Chip took a sneaky swig of toadstool juice before talking. "I need to get to Tinder at the caravan park," he said to the van. "Can you help?" Patricia, the driver of the steaming van, hopped out of it to reply. "Yeah, mate," she said, "just hop in. Just been down to the caves. Man, those cave women are crazy." She laughed throatily, and Chip did hop in, resting his rucksack on his comparatively tiny dragon knees. But it wasn't the journey that Chip had expected. When Patricia started up the van, they didn't go forward. They went upward, straight into the sky. Wow, the big red van could really fly. Faster and faster they flew, over caves, through clouds, over walled gardens, over fields and seas and flower-pot men. Chip had to keep swigging from his bottle to retain a sense of normality. And then they slowed, hovered, and plop, they landed in a garden on a pointy hill, at the top of which was a horribly dreary house, and at the bottom of which was a garden with its own van landing pad. Chip hopped out, knocking his hat against the van's door frame, and looked quizzically at Patricia. "Is this where Tinder lives?" he asked. "No," said Patricia. "The place you want is just over the hill. But I can't take you further. I've had a restraining order. I'm not allowed within 50 paces of the site. You'll find it easily, though, Chip. It's just over the hill." "Oh," said Chip. You've probably noticed that he was a dragon of few words, especially when intoxicated. He waved goodbye to Patricia and began to walk. She'd been right. It didn't take long to get there, and that was just as well. Chip was starting to shake with hunger and with the need for more of his special drink. After warm introductions, hugs from Chip and smoky fire-breathing displays from Tinder, Chip told Tinder about his day's adventures. "My oh my," cried Tinder. "Well, well, well." Chip was confused again. He was accustomed to being confused, but as Tinder walked up to him and blew a smoky, flamy, enticing blast into his face, Chip, all of a sudden, oh no, exhaled an oh no, yes, no. The alcoholic fumes from his previously flameless mouth mixed and melded with Tinder's fiery breath, and oh my goodness, you will never guess what. Not in a million trillion zillion years. Chip, the previously fire-free dragon, was suddenly breathing fire. Chip was breathing fire. Really he was. Oh, you guessed. That's so not fair. And that is the end of this part of the story. Chip learnt to breathe fire, just as Darryl had guessed he would. You see, Darryl had a feeling that Chip and Tinder were made for each other, like a gas stove and a long, thin match. So Tinder and Chip settled into a life of fiery domestic bliss. Tinder forgave Chip his previous misdemeanours and saw him through the Toadstool Juice 13-step programme towards addiction recovery. Chip helped Tinder with everything else. And when Darryl found out what had happened, he was very, very pleased.